Hello. Excuse me. Hello. Welcome to Understanding Trauma. My name is Melissa Adamchik, and I'm Executive Director of the Tri-State Trauma Network. And I want to thank you for taking the time to view this module that has been developed as a pilot for helping the non-clinical population better understand trauma and come away with some helpful information to use in interacting with trauma survivors. A little bit about the Tri-State Trauma Network and our mission. Tri-State Trauma Network has been in existence since May of 2015, and we were formed to help create a community-wide commitment to the prevention of and recovery from trauma and toxic stress. And we go about doing this in a few ways. One is by building community awareness, which is part of what today is about. Secondly, we offer a number of high quality trainings to professionals to help better prepare them to be more effective in their work with trauma survivors. We serve as a clearinghouse for information and resources about trauma, and you can find lots of great resources about trauma, toxic stress, resilience, and trauma-informed care on our website, tristatetraumanetwork.org. We foster collaboration amongst agencies and professionals who are doing this work, and we ultimately are working to develop a trauma-informed, trauma-responsive system of care in the greater Cincinnati area. So here's our learning objectives for the next hour. And I do want to start by giving a trigger warning. When we talk about trauma, it's a lot of sensitive information, especially when we're talking about the types of trauma that people experience. You may know someone who's experienced trauma personally or professionally in your work, and you may have experienced some of your own trauma because it is a common occurrence. So I just want to remind you to be aware of any feelings that might arise in yourself, and urge you to take a moment to step away if you need to, and take care of yourself if you start to have very strong emotional reactions to any of the material. So what we're going to cover in this hour is what is trauma and what are what we call the 3 R's of trauma, to help give a good understanding and definition of trauma. We're going to cover the neurobiology of trauma, and we're also going to cover its prevalence, which will help you understand why it's important for you to recognize and understand the effects of trauma. So a good definition about trauma comes to us from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And what we say about trauma is that individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances. So it doesn't just have to be a one-time situation. It can be an ongoing set of circumstances that is experienced by the individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And that's an important part, because it's the experience of the individual that matters, not what anyone else thinks about the experience. It's how the individual perceives that experience. And trauma has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning in a variety of areas: mental, physical, social, emotional, and even spiritual well-being. So that is the definition that we are going to start with today. And you may have heard some other things about trauma as well, but we are going to zero in a little bit on those 3 E's, which you see underlined, which are event, experience, and effects. So the 3 R's in trauma. You have to have some sort of event or set of circumstances first, and that's the individual experiences it as life-threatening, threat to safety or well-being. So there are some times when it's not some may not consider an event life-threatening, but the person, him or herself, does, and that's what matters, because there's a threat to well-being, safety, security. And then there are some effects of trauma, and those can be consequences in a variety of different domains, like we talked about in the definition. So let's spend a little bit of time on each of these to give you a full understanding. Some potential traumatic events. There are things that people always think of as traumatic, and those are in the abuse category. And it's important to understand that there are a lot of types of abuse beyond sexual and physical. There's also the emotional abuse, which tends to have just as heavy an impact as the physical abuse. And there's witnessing violence also is very much a trauma, especially for people who see that and think that same harm could come to them. So thinking of, witnessing violence in a neighborhood or witnessing domestic violence in the home, even if a child is never hurt, they still have that same reaction to the violence as if it's happening to them. When we think about loss, there are lots of different types of loss, not just death. Many children experience neglect, they experience separation for various reasons. There's, loss of home and safety and security that come from experiences such as natural disasters, terrorism, and war. And then we also want to acknowledge that chronic stressors, over time, that set of circumstances can become traumatic for an individual. So chronic poverty, chronic racism, invasive medical procedures, or an ongoing medical issue that causes a serious threat to the individual. Community trauma, historical trauma is one that people don't always recognize, and the effects of that over time is, as what happens, it changes the way the individual experiencing the trauma at the time receives, and that can change their genetic makeup to the point where they're then passing on different sets of genes that may come to express themselves generations later. And then, of course, we know about how many families experience someone in the family having a substance use disorder, and how that can lead to chronic situations of stress that will impact any individuals involved with the family member. So what about the experience of trauma? What is that affected by? Because not all trauma feels the same, although the body reaction to stress is similar no matter what the trauma is. How the individual perceives that and interprets it is going to depend on a variety of factors. One being how did it happen? So is it a single episode, or is it multiple traumatic events over time, in which case that becomes very complex, what we call complex trauma, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder can result from a series of events over time or throughout life. And those tend to just have a compounding effect on each other and on the individual. When in the person's development did this occur? Of course, the younger the person is, the less coping skills that they are going to have in place to deal with the trauma. So that can be part of how the when will affect people. Where it occurs, is it occurring within a family setting? Is it occurring within a community setting? Is it occurring within an institutional setting? So where it occurs can also play a role in how the person interprets it, and then interprets the world because of it, and how often. So, is this something that the person is experiencing once and they just have to manage that event, or is it being experienced on a regular basis so that they have to constantly be on the alert for this happening again and figure out how to cope with it time and time again? Some other pieces about the experience of trauma that will have an effect on the individual is, what context does it occur in? Is this in a relationship that was a good relationship and a trusting relationship? That can have a more profound impact on the individual. What is the threat like? Is it, a severe threat to life? Or is it a threat to more mental well-being? Experience of trauma can be impacted by interventions. Have any interventions been put in place to assist with processing the trauma? Or, has this gone on with no interventions for a long period of time? Another thing that can happen with the experience of trauma is that, particularly when there's a perpetrator of some sort of abuse, neglect, or something along those lines in a violence situation, where the person has been told, you're not allowed to tell anybody, or something bad's going to happen to you or to someone you love. Is it something, again, that occurs within a trusted relationship where the person feels betrayed and isn't quite sure how to understand or manage that situation? There can also be some subconscious or unrecognized trauma. So, for example, the person may not be aware that something is a trauma until they find out later that, oh, that was actually something that qualifies as a trauma. And no wonder, I felt this way, or things, I functioned in this way. I didn't understand what was going on. So the effect of trauma on an individual can be conceptualized as a normal response to an abnormal situation. And I like this phrase quite a bit and have used it quite a lot, because what we want people to understand when they've experienced a trauma is that the body and brain are reacting in a way that they're supposed to when there is a threat. And the things that are put into place when somebody experiences a trauma in terms of the bodily reactions in this, what we call the stress response, were put there as a survival mechanism. So even though the body and brain at the time aren't sure if the person is, facing a bear in the forest, or somebody who's coming home and drunk from the bar and beating their mother, the same sort of bodily reaction occurs, to where the brain has a fear response and sets into play some chemical reactions and body reactions that prepare the person to fight or flee from the danger. And so we really want to remind people that what they're experiencing is what's supposed to happen, because of the way that the brain and body are designed to help people survive, and that it's not something unusual about them. They did have an unusual or abnormal situation, but their brain and body did exactly what it was supposed to. So trauma can cause short and long-term effects, and those again depend on the different pieces around the experiences or different circumstances. Was there intervention? Was it someone close to them? Did it happen repeatedly over time? Did they have proper supports in place? Even things like, did someone believe that it happened and intend to what they needed to help them get through it? It can affect people's coping responses and relationships and developmental tasks. So we see that when young children experience trauma, that there tends to be a lot of delays in their development, because what normally should be happening in terms of the brain developing and making connections and growing different parts is interrupted by the trauma, and maybe takes a little bit of a different course to reorganize itself to deal with the threat. So because of that, I've mentioned the brain a little bit. There's going to be an impact on just the physiological responses. Someone who is experiencing stress regularly is more likely to set off that stress reaction within the body, even at the slightest sort of an event or instance that would cause a little bit, maybe some people, very minor stress. This person might go into a full stress response because their body has habituated to having to go into that stress response more readily and more frequently. Of course, it's going to affect the person's well-being in different areas. It's going to affect social relationships and often spiritual beliefs. And again, it's because there are so many changes that happen within the brain and body when the trauma occurs. And we're going to get more into that when we go into the neurobiology piece. Okay, so I touched on these a little bit more, but just another reminder that when you have someone coming to you who's experienced some sort of trauma, these are some things to be aware of, as maybe they're telling you their story, telling you what happened, that are going to lead to, a stronger impact on the individual and their well-being. So we're going to talk about how really the medical community came to a better awareness of the effects of trauma on the individual. And this takes us to what is called the ACE study. And ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experience. The ACE study, came about, really, it wasn't planned. It came about through some information that was revealed as patients in an obesity clinic out in California back in the mid-90s, began divulging information to the physician at the clinic about why it was difficult for them to keep weight off. And, in particular, Dr. Vincent Felitti, who was practicing out there at the time, had a client who divulged that putting the weight back on helped her to feel safe, because she didn't want sexual attention because of a childhood experience of sexual abuse. And so that, made him wonder, okay, so how many other people who are having, obesity later in life or ongoing throughout life, or even, or maybe even other health problems, how many of those people were having health problems as a result of some sort of abuse experience or childhood experience that had a long-term impact on them, that was what we call adverse. And could these things, have long-lasting effects, and how prevalent were they within the medical community and within which he was working. So back in 1995 to 97, a series of surveys were given to 17,000 patients within the Kaiser Permanente medical system. And they looked at adverse childhood experiences and whether or not there was some correlation to adult health status. And that was something that, in terms of the people that were being surveyed, we're talking like middle-aged folks. So up to a half century later, were these things still having an effect on the person's health? And unfortunately, but also fortunately, because it led to some different ways of understanding and dealing with trauma, they found out that there was a major effect of adverse childhood experiences on adult health later on, and in many different domains. And so if you want to hear more in depth about the study, we're going to do a few slides on it, but if you want to hear more in depth about the study, there is a resource on our website on the resources page, which gives you like a 15-minute video where Vincent Folletti is talking about the study and all the findings that they had. So they decided to separate adverse childhood experiences into 10 different instances, things that had come up or things that they thought might affect the patients that they were dealing with. And so these were physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and then things that were related to things happening in the household when they were growing up. Was there somebody who was using alcohol or drugs? Was there somebody who had been imprisoned? Was there, a mentally ill member of the family? Did separation or divorce occur? Was there domestic violence? And, were parents absent for whatever reason? And the other piece of this would also be neglect. So those were the 10 items that people were surveyed on as to whether or not that had ever happened to them from 0 to 18. And what was found, really the short of it is that as the ACE score increased for individuals, the risks for all these health problems here on this slide increases in a strong and graded fashion. So, an ACE score of 1 isn't going to have as heavy an effect as an ACE score of 4. And so as the ACE number increased, there was a greater likelihood for alcohol abuse and drug use, and but also lots of chronic health problems and or severe health problems like COPD and heart disease and STDs, and then things that we think of as more along the mental health lines, but also have a very physical component like depression, suicidality, intimate partner violence risks increase depending on the number of ACEs that were experienced. People would start smoking earlier, they would start having sex earlier. All these things led to more risky sexual behaviors, and even things like fetal death during pregnancy. The body was at risk for all of these things because of things that had happened that had been traumatic in childhood. And so that sort of blew everybody away in terms of, wow, how can this even be true? And to be quite honest, it took about 10 years for this to make its way to, general knowledge within the medical and mental health community, because it was pretty shocking. This pyramid here shows, how do we get to this point? of these experiences causing such, strong diseases and disabilities within the individual. And so this pyramid takes you through that. You start with the adverse childhood experience, and because of what's happening in terms of the body and brain with the stress response and the chemicals released, you're getting disrupted development of the neurological system, the brain. And then because of that, you're finding that children are having social, emotional, and cognitive impairments because the normal processes of brain development are being disrupted. And these things aren't able to grow in the way that they should because too much time is being spent on dealing with the threats and the trauma and the stress. So then this leads people to be more likely to adopt certain risky health behaviors, such as the smoking and the drinking and promiscuity. And so as a result of that, you see more disease, disability, more social problems, people just having a hard time in general functioning well. And ultimately, this leads to early death. It was found that people with 6 or more of the adverse childhood experiences had, on average, a 20-year reduction in lifespan. And so this becomes, a very serious health problem, and trauma just wasn't ever thought of as being this impactful prior to this study, and then it coming into the awareness of the rest of the medical and mental health community, and some advances, in care so that people could actually look at what was happening to the brain and see, this isn't just what we think, we also see it happening. So how common are these then, and what did they find? So of these 17,000 members of this, health system out in California, they found 1 in 4 were exposed to 2 categories of ACEs. 1 in 16 was exposed to 4. 22% were sexually abused as children. 66% of the women surveyed experienced abuse, violence, or family strife in childhood. So that's quite a large number. And since then, lots of other studies have been done to try to replicate that. And to this day, there are people asking about adverse childhood experiences, in pediatric settings, and especially mental health settings, but also lots of doctors are taking information from families about the experiences that the child has had, and so that they can help connect that to what they're experiencing medically. And so some of the other, general statistics that have been found, so over 60% of adults have had at least one traumatic event in their life. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys have been sexually abused before adulthood. And 71% of children are exposed to violence each year. And that, those things are pretty alarming to hear. And this is why many consider trauma to be a major public health issue and not something that just belongs to the mental health community. But we all need to be aware of trauma and its effects and try to do things to either mitigate the effects or prevent it in the first place. Often you'll see that, trauma is hidden in plain sight because people will see the impact of trauma in certain behaviors that are considered, unlikable. But often when people are seeing these things and they're sort of putting the individuals in a negative light because of these certain behaviors, that they've seen, they're failing to see or to understand that the person's trauma experience played quite a large role in the behaviors that they're showing, that, people don't want to be a part of and don't want to see happen. And so it's led us in the mental health community to make sure that we understand what happened and we get at the root of those behaviors so that we can help the person understand even themselves why these are happening, and that there are things that they can do to cope better with what has happened and with the ongoing stress from it. So this leads us into, some of the things that we see when there's been a traumatic event. And what I want you to understand first and foremost is that when somebody is overwhelmed and there's a huge threat to life and safety and security, what they're doing as a response is an adaptive response to what's happening. And although that may no longer be happening in the present, the effects of that carry over, and the person responds as if it's still happening, because trauma doesn't have a timestamp on it. And unless it's been dealt with, it can feel as if any sort of trigger that reminds them of the trauma brings it right back to the present. So it can feel as if it's still happening. So we see all these things that that maybe, you've seen or heard from clients that you've worked with in the legal field. And I want people to recognize that there are so many things that shouldn't be just written off as a negative behavior, that we should really try to understand where are these coming from. And it's not to say that just because somebody's experiencing depression, they absolutely had a traumatic event, but it's something to consider and to look for. So many disorders can happen as a result of trauma, and you'll see several of those on here. And not just what people think of as, the trauma disorder, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. That has a very strict, set of symptoms for people to qualify for that disorder, but they may not fully qualify for it, but they may have still experienced a trauma and just be showing some other types of symptoms. Some additional signs of trauma or hallmarks of trauma that we will see are the flashbacks, sensitivity to noise or touch, always expecting something bad to happen, because they really do have their view of the world kind of revolves around not feeling safe because of the trauma. And so not feeling safe, not feeling hopeful, because that's been their experience. So they might always expect that something bad's going to happen right around the corner, which makes them feel on edge and hypervigilant, always watchful of what's going on around them. There can be, sort of blocks of time where memories aren't available to the person, because sometimes the way that people deal with trauma is by burying the memories a bit as a way to protect themselves so that they don't have to deal with them on a regular basis. They could just become emotionally numb so that nothing seems to affect them. And of course, it's hard to concentrate if you've experienced a trauma and you're getting these flashbacks and intrusive thoughts and memories. So it really makes it hard to concentrate. And not only that, the effects on the brain, again, that we'll talk about, sort of diminish some of those higher level thinking types of activities and higher level brain functions, such as concentrating and even just sitting still and managing the body and handling sensory input and all those sorts of things. So if you are seeing that someone is presenting with these things, then again, that's a normal reaction to the abnormal situation or situations that they've experienced. But it doesn't mean that they have to live with these forever. And I'll give you a minute to take a look at these as well. And, if we were in a setting where we were live, I would ask people what are some things that they've seen in clients that they've had that might suggest trauma. So if any of these seem to ring a bell. Okay. And that would be our discussion question. So let's get into how trauma affects the brain, because all these things might be, overwhelming. There's a big list of symptoms and behaviors and, physical effects, emotional effects, psychological effects. And it really does help to be able to understand where this is coming from. So I'm going to switch over to this video, and I know that I have to do a little finagling with the screen share to get this to come up. So give me just a minute.
The brain develops from the bottom up. The first thing to develop is the brainstem, or the reptilian brain.
Hold on just a second. I'm going to make sure that that's bigger and make sure that that's what is showing up on your screen, because otherwise we'll just lose 4.5 minutes here. Okay, let me get the right one up. Okay. All right. There we go.
Some people might call it. This area is responsible for our bodily functions. It tells us when to regulate our temperature, when to sleep, and when to eat. The next important part of our brains to develop is the limbic system, or what some people might call the mammalian part of the brain. The limbic system supports a variety of functions, including emotion, behavior, motivation, and long-term memory. The next part of the brain to develop is the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. This is sometimes considered the human part because humans are one of the only mammals that develop this part of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for how we as humans were able to develop language, have thoughts, self-awareness, perception, and consciousness. Also, the cortex plays a key role in integrating the central nervous system and functions of memory. The last and most advanced part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is considered the executive functioning part of the brain. For some people, this part doesn't fully develop until they're in their mid to late 20s. The prefrontal cortex helps us to think through cause and effect, the ability to plan for the future, set goals, and understand the consequences of our actions. It's also responsible for the ability to moderate social behavior. When we're in a stressful situation, part of our limbic system called the amygdala sets off an alarm bell response to let us know we're in danger and we need to do something about it. When this happens, the brain floods with a hormone called cortisol, so the body knows that something needs to be done. The most common responses to a stressful or dangerous situation are some you might be familiar with: fight, flight, freeze, or submit. This is an inbuilt system of survival to keep us safe when we're in danger. Like when our ancestors might have had to decide whether to stand their ground and fight against a large predator or run away. A stress response is a healthy, normal part of being a human. It lets us know that our bodies are working and keeping us safe. If a person is exposed to a highly stressful or traumatic event, or they have continual exposure to stressful events like abuse or neglect, their alarm system might become overactive. It might be always switched on, as if there was a risk of danger or threat at all times. For a child, this might affect how their brain develops. This is especially the case if it's in the context of stress or trauma events by a primary caregiver. In these cases, the child might develop an understanding of the world as an unsafe and dangerous place, even when they are in a safe situation. Sometimes this is called hypervigilance. It means being on edge or aware of danger at all times. Being exposed to stressful and traumatic events on a regular basis can also have a significant impact on neural connections in the memory center. It can even change the way we remember actual events. People use alcohol and other drugs for a variety of reasons. When someone's experienced trauma, they might be in a constant state of fight or flight, and so might use substances to help move them out of their stress response state. We also know that substance use can affect the way that our brain functions. Chemicals from substances cross the blood-brain barrier and can either stimulate or depress different parts of the central nervous system, affecting how the person feels, thinks, and acts. Similar to cortisol flooding the brain in the stress response, chemicals from alcohol and other drugs can also affect neural pathways and the way the person might make decisions or remember events. Luckily, neural pathways have the lifelong ability to form and change. You might have heard this referred to as neural plasticity. Through developing a better understanding of the brain and the way trauma and alcohol and other drugs affect neural pathways, clients can be better informed and empowered. This is an intervention itself called psychoeducation.
Okay. So, this is something that I might ask people to react to if we were in person. Hopefully you found that informative. It does give a good look at the brain development and how trauma affects what goes on in terms of brain development. And it does have a piece there about alcohol and drug abuse. And I think that that's just important to remember because of the number of individuals who have difficulty with alcohol and drug abuse in our community. So a few things to take away from that and remember are that, brain development has a bottom-up organization. So as you heard, the brain stem develops first, and that's your most basic sort of functions like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and that sort of thing. And then when we get into the midbrain, and that is here in the middle, see that green area. And that is an important place for us to focus on for a moment because that is where the limbic system is located, which is also where the amygdala is located, which is our fear center. And so if that fear center becomes really active because of trauma and threats to life and safety early on, then it tends to be larger because it's being used more often. And when that happens, that's how we get to a place where we're seeing delays in children who've experienced trauma, because after that, things move up to the front of the brain and the top of the brain, which is where the prefrontal cortex is. And that's where those higher cognitive functionings occur. And so the child may not have had a chance to develop those as well because of all the trauma. And that reaction becomes so frequent, the fear reaction becomes so frequent and readily available that they don't even get a chance to process it in a different way. And this may carry on to even adult behaviors where people are extra impulsive when under stress, and they are defensive and lash out frequently because they aren't getting the opportunity for that information even to reach the front of the brain. And again, that also affects social skills. and not just the cognitive functioning, but being able to make sense of other people's behaviors and interact in appropriate ways, and to understand the emotions of others. And so that's why we're seeing those delays in children, and maybe even and that same impact in adults when they're under lots of stress or have experienced lots of trauma, where they're not seeming like they're able to access all those functions. This is just a quick look at how different parts of the brain and their development are affected by interaction with different people. And so this is why things like neglect and or some sort of abuse by the mother or a caregiver is going to cause some delays in some of those middle brain functions, like being able to regulate the body and regulate emotions and even sleep, or manage hunger. And then because people who've experienced trauma aren't always as well connected socially, um, they may continue to have difficulty with their emotional reactivity and ability to attach to others, and have appropriate sexual behavior. So this tells us a little bit more about how, also it tells us a little bit more about how to help people who've experienced trauma, by building their affiliation with others and building their social connections. That really does help them to have better coping skills when stress occurs, because they can reach out to others for assistance. They can feel, a sense of safety and belonging, which tends to help soothe the alarm that goes off when someone has a fear response. So we've talked a little bit about the fear response too, and this is just an opportunity to remind you guys that the fear response does occur in the amygdala, which is in that mid part of the brain. So that the alarm is sounded, and that person has to quickly react to it. And that is, again, something that was put in place to help people survive, but may not always work in the way we want it to if it's kind of an overreaction to a stimuli, or it's used too often. And so when we work with people who've survived trauma, we really want to help calm down the body and that fear response. And there are lots of ways that therapists do that, and that other people can have a role in that as well. And that's for another training. So one thing, even to do as somebody who's interacting with trauma survivors, one thing that you can do is just to be a calm presence, so that even though they escalate, you're not escalating. So when you see somebody who's anxious, as people often are when they're dealing with a legal situation, the more you can do to be a calm presence and to help them, maybe just take a few minutes to breathe and, get focused on what's going on. The more you can do to prepare them for what's going to happen, the better. So that one, that they can understand what's happening, two, that they can appropriately articulate, and that they, don't have to continue to have this heightened sense of anxiety throughout any of the legal proceedings. An important point to remember, and this was touched on in the video, is that there is neuroplasticity. And so what this means is that the brain is always able to change throughout life. And so something that happened, early on, there are ways to affect the brain in positive manners and to create new neural connections and new, which lead to new patterns of behavior, ways to help the person get to the point where that alarm isn't going off as often, or when it does, they know some things to do to get it to calm down, and they know some ways to stop. And so want to leave with that message of, yes, there's hope, because we're constantly learning, and the brain is able to shift and adapt in amazing ways, which means that people don't have to be stuck in their trauma response, and they don't have to be stuck in all the after effects of the trauma over time. So just to reiterate, I know you guys aren't therapists, so what can you do? It's important to listen, to try to understand where the person's coming from, take that stance of, what happened and how did we get to where we are. Be a safe and calm presence, validate feelings, that's huge. Oftentimes people who have been traumatized are highly emotionally reactive, but the feeling makes sense. Even though it may seem a little extreme, the feeling does make sense. And so we want to validate, that, yes, I can understand why you'd be scared of this. And yes, I can understand why you're feeling depressed about this situation. And just, using that piece of what you're experiencing is a normal response to that traumatic experience that you had. You can refer to mental health services. And I want to develop a follow-up training on trauma-informed approaches for more guidance. So I would love to hear more about what you would need help with in your practice and in what you're doing with clients in the legal field, so that I can tailor some of the trauma-informed principles to the work that you're doing. So again, thank you so much for your time and your feedback, and I look forward to hearing from you. These are some additional resources on the effects of trauma on development if you would like to explore those. I will give you that information as well. All right, thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording and hopefully hear from you soon.